On December 9, 2024, at 14:41 UTC, taikonaut Blake Chen became the first human being to film something that, according to every principle of lunar geology we understand, cannot exist. The Chang'e 8 lander had touched down in Oceanus Procellarum, the ocean of storms, one of the Moon's largest maria, at precisely 18.4 degrees north latitude, 57.1 degrees west longitude. Blake, 34 years old, former People's Liberation Army Air Force fighter pilot, with 2,847 hours of flight time, 6 years of astronaut training, and a master's degree in astrophysics from Tsinghua University, was conducting the mission's primary objective: deploying the rover to collect regolith samples from Marius Crater's western rim. What he captured instead was 14 minutes and 32 seconds of continuous high-definition video showing a geometric structure 187 meters tall, rising from the crater floor with mathematically perfect angles of 51.8 degrees. The exact proportional angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Not approximate. Not similar. Identical to within 0.03 degrees, a precision that natural lunar formations cannot achieve because the Moon's surface has been bombarded by micrometeorites for 4.5 billion years, a process that erodes any sharp angles into smooth curves within tens of millions of years. Yet there it stood, sharp-edged and geometrically flawless, casting a shadow exactly 143 meters long in the lunar morning sun. Blake's first transmission to China National Space Administration Mission Control in Beijing was textbook professional, his voice calm and measured despite what his helmet camera was recording. Beijing, this is Chen. I have visual on an anomalous geological formation, Marius Crater, bearing 270 degrees from lander, range approximately 800 meters. Structure appears pyramidal. Requesting confirmation of previous survey data for this location. The response took 2.6 seconds, the speed of light delay for Earth-Moon communication. But when it came, there was something in the flight director's voice that Blake's training helped him recognize. Hesitation. Not the routine acknowledgement of a minor discovery, but the verbal equivalent of someone seeing something on a screen they weren't prepared to see. Chen, we copy. Hold position. Maintain video feed. We are reviewing previous orbital imagery. Blake held position. The rover's cameras, designed to capture microscopic details in regolith samples, recorded the structure from 3 different angles over the next 9 minutes. The video showed stratification, regular horizontal layers visible along one exposed face, that bore no resemblance to the chaotic deposition patterns of volcanic maria. It showed corner edges that met at precise right angles, not the rounded intersections of natural rock formations subjected to thermal stress cycles of -173 degrees Celsius to 127 degrees Celsius every 29.5 days. And it showed something else that Blake noticed only when he zoomed to maximum magnification. The surface texture wasn't regolith covered like everything else on the Moon. It had an albedo, a measure of reflectivity, of 0.47, nearly double that of typical lunar highlands. Whatever this structure was made of, it reflected light differently than any known lunar material. 6 hours after Blake's initial transmission, Dr. Riley Morrison, a 41-year-old lunar geologist and image analyst at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, was conducting routine review of data shared under the International Lunar Exploration Coordination Group protocols, a transparency agreement where all major space agencies share non-classified scientific data from lunar missions. The Chang'e 8 mission had been transmitting publicly available telemetry and low-resolution imagery since landing, and Riley's job was to cross-reference Chinese findings with NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter archives to identify any scientifically interesting sites for potential future American missions. When the Marius Crater data packet arrived at 21:37 UTC, 11 hours and 56 minutes after Blake's initial discovery, Riley immediately noticed something wrong. The transmitted images showed Marius Crater's western rim exactly as LRO had photographed it in 2019. A gently sloping basin wall with typical impact-scattered boulders and a few small secondary craters. Nothing unusual, nothing geometric, nothing 187 meters tall. Riley pulled up the LRO high-resolution images from 6 months earlier. Same result. Empty crater floor. Then she pulled up the lower-resolution public imagery that CNSA had transmitted during Chang'e 8's descent phase, time-stamped at 14:38 UTC, 3 minutes before landing. The structure was clearly visible in those images. A dark triangular shape, shadow stretching westward, unmistakable against the gray regolith. But in the official processed images released 11 hours later, it was gone. Not blurred, not obscured by dust from the landing. Gone. Replaced pixel-perfect with terrain that matched the surrounding crater floor. Riley Morrison had worked at NASA for 16 years. She had analyzed over 2 million lunar images. She understood orbital mechanics, photogrammetry, and the 14 different ways that image compression artifacts could create false patterns. This wasn't an artifact. This was editorial replacement. Deliberate, sophisticated, and recent. She drafted an email to her supervisor, then paused. NASA and CNSA had collaborative agreements, but they also had competitive interests. Accusing the Chinese space program of doctoring scientific data without absolute proof would create diplomatic complications. She needed confirmation. She needed the original video. What Riley didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting in her Houston office while Blake Chen was being transferred to an undisclosed CNSA facility for what officials would call advanced mission debriefing, was that she wasn't the only person who had noticed the discrepancy. Marcus Webb, an investigative technology journalist who had spent 7 years covering space industry developments and who maintained a network of sources across 3 continents, had received an encrypted message at 22:09 UTC from an anonymous account using a disposable email server. The message contained no text, only a file. 14 minutes and 32 seconds of helmet camera footage showing a pyramid on the moon, metadata intact, timestamps verified, and a structure that violated every geological principle Marcus had ever learned. The message had been sent from somewhere inside China's Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. And by the time Marcus downloaded it, every public trace of Blake Chen's discovery had been systematically erased from CNSA's databases, replaced with images showing nothing but empty lunar regolith where something impossible had stood just hours before. Marcus Webb had learned, over 7 years of covering classified military satellite programs and off-the-record conversations with engineers who'd worked on projects that officially didn't exist, that the most revealing information often came not from what people said, but from how quickly they stopped saying it. The helmet camera footage he'd received showed timestamps, telemetry overlays, and metadata that would take a professional video forensics team weeks to fabricate convincingly. He had 48 hours before the source's digital trail went cold, before whoever sent this realized the risk they'd taken and disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machinery of China's space program. Marcus made 3 decisions in the span of 15 minutes. First, he uploaded encrypted copies to 4 separate cloud servers in different jurisdictions. Second, he sent the raw footage to Dr. Shane Park, a geophysicist at MIT who'd published 17 peer-reviewed papers on lunar volcanic formations and who had no institutional ties to any space agency. Third, he published a preliminary analysis on his independent aerospace news site at 0130 UTC on December 10th, 24 hours and 49 minutes after Blake Chen had first pointed his camera at something that shouldn't exist. The article was careful, technical, and deliberately understated. It presented the video, outlined the geometric impossibilities, noted the subsequent image replacement in official channels, and asked a single question. If this is a compression artifact or equipment malfunction, as CNSA's initial statement suggests, why were the original images systematically replaced rather than simply annotated with a technical explanation? The article went live at 0130 UTC. By 0315 UTC, it had been shared 11,000 times across scientific forums and aerospace industry message boards. By 0547 UTC, Marcus received a copyright takedown notice claiming the helmet camera footage violated CNSA's proprietary data agreements, despite the fact that under International Lunar Exploration Coordination Group protocols, all scientific imagery from publicly funded missions was supposed to be released within 96 hours of acquisition. By 0720 UTC, Marcus's article had been removed from 3 different hosting platforms for terms of service violations that were never specified. By 0933 UTC, every copy of the video that had been shared publicly had been systematically deleted, scrubbed from social media platforms with an efficiency that suggested coordination far beyond CNSA's typical public relations response time. But by then, Dr. Shane Park had already completed his initial analysis, and what he found was worse than Marcus had suspected, because it wasn't just about what the structure looked like, it was about what it was made of and how long it had been there. Shane Park had spent 12 years studying the moon's volcanic history, analyzing how basaltic lava flows created the dark Maria regions, how impact events fractured and melted, and redistributed material across the surface. He understood lunar stratigraphy the way a master carpenter understands wood grain, intuitively and completely. The structure in Blake Chen's video showed layering that was regular, horizontal, and consistent, characteristics that only appear in sedimentary deposits formed by liquid water or in artificial construction. The moon has never had liquid water on its surface. That left one option. But Shane's analysis went deeper than just visual inspection. He'd written software that could analyze subtle variations in image brightness to estimate surface composition based on how different materials reflect sunlight. When he ran Blake's footage through spectroscopic analysis, measuring the specific wavelengths of reflected light, the results showed an albedo signature that didn't match any known lunar material. Not basalt, not anorthosite, not any of the highlands materials that make up the moon's crust. The closest match in his database was processed titanium alloy, but that was impossible because titanium, while present in lunar soil as ilmenite ore, doesn't naturally separate and purify itself into reflective metallic surfaces. Then Shane looked at the crater density on the structure's visible faces, and his hands went still on the keyboard, because crater density is how planetary geologists date surfaces. Every square kilometer of the moon accumulates approximately 200 small impact craters per billion years. By counting craters on the structure's exposed surfaces and comparing them to the surrounding regolith, Shane could estimate how long it had been standing there. The number his software calculated was 3.2 billion years, plus or minus 400 million, which meant this structure, if it was artificial, and every piece of evidence suggested it was, had been built when Earth's atmosphere was still primarily methane and nitrogen, when the only life on our planet was single-celled bacteria floating in shallow oceans, when the Moon was 30,000 kilometers closer to Earth than it is now, and a day on our planet lasted only 19 hours instead of 24. Marcus published Shane's analysis at 14:20 UTC on December 11th, exactly 48 hours after Blake's initial discovery. This time, the response wasn't just digital suppression. This time, Commander Jade Whitmore, 62 years old, veteran NASA astronaut with 3 Apollo-era missions that weren't part of the official Apollo program but were conducted under classified military authorizations in the mid-1970s, made a public statement through her personal blog, a platform she rarely used except for occasional reflections on space policy. Her statement was 6 sentences long. I have reviewed the imagery from Chang'e 8's Marius Crater Survey. I have consulted with former colleagues who participated in lunar reconnaissance programs between 1972 and 1978. We photographed similar geometric anomalies in Hadley Rill during our missions. Our instructions were clear. Photograph, catalog, do not publicly comment. The classification level assigned to those photographs remains active. I can say nothing more without violating oaths I took 50 years ago. But I can say this. Blake Chen saw what he saw, and he is not the first. Within 3 hours, Jade Whitmore's blog was taken offline for scheduled maintenance. Within 6 hours, NASA issued a statement clarifying that Commander Whitmore's missions were experimental research flights, and that any classified imagery from that era related to Cold War reconnaissance activities, not anomalous lunar features. Within 12 hours, every Freedom of Information Act request filed by aerospace journalists regarding Apollo 15 photography of Hadley Ryle was archived under a little-known classification called National Security Space Activities, the same designation used for imagery from spy satellites capable of reading license plates from orbit, the same designation used for nuclear weapon early warning systems, the same designation that required presidential authorization to declassify. For geological photographs of a crater on the Moon, taken 53 years ago. Riley Morrison, working late in her Houston office because the implications of what she'd seen wouldn't let her sleep, noticed something else in the orbital data. She pulled up planned trajectories for every lunar mission scheduled for the next 18 months. NASA's Artemis 3, Russia's Luna 27, India's Chandrayaan-4, Japan's SLIM 2. Every single one had filed trajectory updates within 72 hours of Blake Chen's discovery. Small adjustments, explained as orbital efficiency optimizations or updated landing site selections based on recent scientific data. But when Riley plotted the new trajectories on her lunar map, a pattern emerged that made her chest tighten. Every mission had altered course to avoid Oceanus Procellarum, not obviously, not dramatically. Just enough that their ground tracks would pass no closer than 80 kilometers to Marius Crater. 4 different countries, 4 different agencies, all making the same adjustment within the same narrow time window, as if someone had sent a message that everyone had received and understood without needing to discuss it publicly. As if there was a protocol for this. As if it had happened before. Dr. Harper Reeves had built her career on a premise that most archaeologists considered fringe speculation, and most astronomers dismissed entirely. That if intelligent civilizations had existed in our solar system before humans evolved, they would have left traces, and the best place to look for those traces wasn't on planetary surfaces subjected to billions of years of geological recycling, but on airless moons where erosion happens so slowly that structures could potentially survive for geological epochs. She called it SETI archaeology, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence through ancient artifacts rather than radio signals. And she'd spent 8 years cataloging every unexplained geometric anomaly ever photographed on the Moon, Mars, and the larger asteroids. Her database contained 463 candidates, most of them easily explained as pareidolia or unusual but natural formations. 11 remained genuinely anomalous, lacking clear geological formation mechanisms. 7 of those 11 were on the Moon. And when Marcus Webb sent her Blake Chen's footage, along with Shane Park's analysis, Harper did something that seemed obvious in retrospect, but that no one had thought to do before. She plotted all 7 anomalies on a high-resolution selenographic map and looked for spatial relationships. What she found was a pattern so precise that the probability of it occurring naturally was 1 in 847 trillion. The 7 structures formed a perfect hexagon. Not approximate, not roughly hexagonal. Perfect to within 0.07 kilometers across a span of 1,247 kilometers, which meant the angular precision was better than 0.005 degrees. Blake Chen's pyramid in Marius crater was 1 vertex. Another was in Tsiolkovsky crater on the far side, photographed by Soviet Luna 3 in 1959 and dismissed as a geometric boulder formation. A third was in Aristarchus Plateau, visible in multiple Apollo 15 images, but catalogued as unusual reflective deposit. Composition unknown. The fourth sat in Grimaldi Basin, noted in Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter data as anomalous albedo feature, requires follow-up observation. The fifth was in Hadley Rill, the exact location Jade Whitmore had mentioned in her brief public statement. The sixth was in Oriental Basin, photographed during Apollo 16's orbital survey, and marked in mission notes as structure-like shadow, probable lighting artifact. And the seventh, which Harper found only after 3 days of exhaustive archive searching, appeared in a single classified image from a military lunar reconnaissance satellite launched in 1998, visible for exactly 1 orbital pass before the satellite's trajectory was adjusted and it never photographed that region again. The center of the hexagon fell on the lunar far side, in a region that no human mission had ever directly observed, at coordinates that put it forever hidden from Earth by the Moon's synchronous rotation. Each vertex contained either a pyramidal structure or an angular formation incompatible with natural geology. Each structure showed the same anomalous albedo signature. And each one, when crater density analysis was applied, dated to approximately 3.2 billion years old, plus or minus the margin of error, which meant they were all the same age, built or placed during the same narrow window of deep geological time. Harper published her findings in a peer-reviewed paper submitted to the journal Icarus on December 15th. The paper was rejected within 18 hours, not on scientific grounds, but with a note from the editor stating that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and photographic analysis alone, however rigorous, cannot establish artificial origin without ground truth verification. It was a reasonable position. It was also, Harper suspected, cover for the fact that publishing this kind of analysis would immediately trigger questions that institutions weren't ready to answer. She posted the paper on an open-access preprint server instead. Within 6 hours, she received an encrypted email from someone identifying himself only as former NRO imaging analyst, resigned 2021. The email contained 3 attached files, each marked with classification headers that made Harper's pulse accelerate. Cosmic Top Secret. Eyes Only. No Foreign Nationals. National Security Space Activities. The images showed higher resolution views of 3 of the hexagon's vertices, captured by National Reconnaissance Office satellites, whose existence was officially unacknowledged, but whose capabilities were legendary among people who tracked classified space programs. The images were dated 1998, 2003, and 2011. Each showed structures that were undeniably artificial, undeniably ancient, and undeniably part of a coordinated pattern. But the email contained something else, buried in the metadata of the third image file, a spectrographic analysis conducted during a total lunar eclipse on December 10, 2011, when Earth's shadow had covered the Moon completely, and surface temperatures had dropped by 200 degrees Celsius in less than 90 minutes. During that eclipse, NRO's classified infrared satellite had detected a radio frequency emission coming from the center of the hexagon, the point on the far side that had never been directly observed. The emission was at 38 Hz, far below typical radio communications, but perfect for penetrating lunar regolith. It had lasted exactly 11 minutes. Then it had stopped and never repeated, despite continuous monitoring during 6 subsequent eclipses. Tyler Novak, the source who'd sent those files, had resigned from the National Reconnaissance Office 3 years earlier after watching that 38 Hz signal get classified under protocols normally reserved for nuclear weapons design information. He'd spent those 3 years waiting for someone to connect the patterns he'd seen, and when Harper's paper appeared online, he'd recognized that she'd found what he'd been forbidden to discuss. His email ended with a single paragraph. The signal analysis was forwarded to the Pentagon's Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force in 2012. They classified it Cosmic Top Secret within 48 hours. That classification level is above special access programs. It's above nuclear weapon data. It means that unauthorized disclosure is considered a threat to national survival. For a radio signal from the Moon, think about what that implies. Think about what they know that we don't. See, Marcus Webb, following chains of evidence that were getting harder to ignore, managed to secure a brief interview with Dr. Raymond Torres, who'd served as NASA's deputy administrator from 2009 to 2016, and who had, in retirement, become slightly more willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Marcus asked him directly, "Did NASA know about these structures during the Apollo program?" Torres was silent for 7 seconds, an eternity in a recorded interview. Then he said, "We knew there were questions. We didn't have answers. We still don't have answers. But here's what I can tell you. There are things on the Moon that don't fit our models. There are images in classified archives that raise profound questions about lunar history. And there are reasons, good reasons, reasons involving global stability, why those questions have been investigated quietly rather than publicly." 2 days later, Marcus received a message through an intermediary who worked in CNSA's International Liaison Office, someone who'd helped Marcus verify technical details on previous stories about China's space program. The message was brief and couldn't be traced back to its source, but it contained information that had never been made public. Blake Chen's family had received a final encrypted communication from him on December 11th, 2 hours before his official debriefing began, and 36 hours before he disappeared from public view. The message had been run through multiple translation programs by the family, trying to make sense of what seemed like stress-induced confusion, but the Chinese characters were clear and unambiguous. Blake had written, "Saw door. Door was open." 3 words that made no sense unless you understood what he'd been looking at through his helmet camera. 3 words that suggested the pyramid wasn't a monument or a marker. 3 words that implied the structure had an interior, a function, a purpose. And the word was, past tense, suggesting that when Blake had first seen it, the door had been sealed. But by the time he'd finished filming, something had changed. Dr. Quinn Castellano had spent 15 years studying the Fermi paradox, the contradiction between the high probability of extraterrestrial civilizations existing and the complete absence of evidence for them, and had published 2 books arguing that the Great Filter, the hypothetical barrier that prevents civilizations from becoming spacefaring and detectable, likely existed somewhere in our future rather than our past. It was a comforting thought, the idea that humanity had already survived the hardest steps and that our extinction wasn't inevitable. But when Marcus Webb sent her Harper Reeves's hexagon analysis and Shane Park's 3.2 billion-year dating estimate, Quinn spent 72 hours recalculating every assumption she'd ever made about the timeline of intelligence in the universe. If the structures were artificial, and if they were truly that ancient, then the implications rewrote not just human history, but cosmic history, because 3.2 billion years ago, Earth's atmosphere had only recently begun accumulating oxygen from cyanobacteria. The most complex life on our planet was single-celled algae, and the first multicellular organisms wouldn't appear for another 2 billion years. Yet something, had possessed the technology and motivation to build a geometric pattern of structures on our moon during an epoch when Earth was still a hostile world of shallow, toxic seas and barren continents. The mathematical probability that 2 intelligent civilizations would arise independently in the same solar system was already infinitesimally small. The probability that one would build monuments on the other's moon billions of years before that other civilization evolved was so close to zero that it suggested something more disturbing, that whoever built these structures had known Earth would eventually develop intelligent life, had marked our moon deliberately, had been watching our world across geological timescales that made human history look like a brief flicker. Connor Mills, a systems engineer with the European Space Agency who specialized in mission trajectory analysis and orbital mechanics, had been following the story with the kind of methodical attention that came from 23 years of ensuring that spacecraft went exactly where they were supposed to go and nowhere else. When he saw that 4 different space agencies had altered their lunar mission trajectories within the same narrow time window, his professional instincts told him this wasn't coincidence, it was coordination, which meant there was communication happening through channels that weren't public. Connor had access to historical mission databases that most researchers didn't, archives containing telemetry logs and communication transcripts from every major lunar mission dating back to Apollo 11. He started looking for patterns, specifically communication anomalies, periods when radio contact was interrupted, degraded, or inexplicably terminated. What he found was a timeline of systematic anomalies spanning 55 years. Apollo 11 had experienced 8 minutes of communication dropout during orbital pass over the far side, officially attributed to antenna positioning issues, despite the fact that mission protocols required redundant communication systems for precisely that reason. Apollo 15 had a 47-minute gap during which Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmidt's EVA transmissions were interrupted, logged as solar interference despite no solar weather data showing minimal activity that day. The Soviet Luna 24 sample return mission had lost telemetry for 12 minutes during descent, a gap that Soviet engineers never adequately explained. China's Chang'e 4 relay satellite, positioned to maintain communication with their far-side lander, had experienced 19 minutes of signal degradation that engineers attributed to unexpected thermal effects on electronics, despite the satellite functioning perfectly before and after. Every crewed mission to lunar orbit had experienced at least one communication anomaly. Every single one. And when Connor plotted the spacecraft positions during those anomalies on his orbital mechanics software, the pattern made his hands go cold. Every communication dropout occurred when the spacecraft passed within 30 to 50 kilometers of one of the hexagon's vertices, as if proximity to those structures triggered some kind of interference or, and this possibility was worse, as if something at those locations was actively monitoring passing spacecraft and selectively disrupting communications. Marcus obtained audio recordings that had been preserved in personal archives by retired mission controllers, recordings that had never made it into official NASA transcripts because they'd been flagged for review and then quietly archived without explanation. One recording, from Apollo 17's geological survey of Taurus-Littrow Valley on December 13, 1972, captured astronaut Eugene Cernan's voice during what was supposed to be a routine examination of Shorty Crater. "Houston, we have visual on multiple light sources in formation, bearing approximately 190 degrees. Elevation may be 15 degrees above horizon. They're distinct. They're moving in synchronized pattern. These are not stars, not reflections from the LM, not Earthlight. They appear to be—" There was a pause, 3 seconds of silence, then Mission Control's voice, clipped and urgent. "Apollo 17, switch to secure channel Alpha 7 immediately." The public transmission ended. Whatever Cernan saw next, whatever he reported during that secure channel communication, remained classified 53 years later under the same National Security Space Activities designation that protected nuclear weapon deployment data. Marcus reached out to Cernan's family, to former mission controllers, to anyone who might have knowledge of what happened during those missing minutes. No one would speak on record. But one former Apollo-era flight director, now 81 years old and willing to talk only on condition of complete anonymity, told Marcus, "Gene saw something that made Houston invoke protocols we'd hoped we'd never have to use. Those protocols existed because there were contingency plans for contact scenarios, plans written in 1967, before Apollo even flew. Someone anticipated this possibility. Someone knew we might not be alone up there. Through channels that took weeks to establish and required assurances that would protect his source's identity, even from government investigators, Marcus secured a conversation with a former Soviet cosmonaut who'd trained for lunar missions in the 1980s, missions that were cancelled before they flew, despite billions of rubles invested and hardware already constructed. The cosmonaut, speaking through an interpreter and using encryption protocols that suggested he understood the risks of what he was revealing, explained that the USSR had planned an ambitious mission for 1988, a heavy-lift landing in Oceanus Procellarum with a crew of 3 and equipment designed for extended surface operations and deep regolith drilling. The mission was cancelled 6 weeks before its scheduled launch. Official reason: economic constraints as the Soviet Union's financial crisis deepened. But the cosmonaut said, "We received warning, not from American intelligence, not from our own military, from scientific channels. Recommendation that mission be postponed pending further orbital reconnaissance." But reconnaissance of what? We had detailed maps. We knew the landing site. The warning was specific. Do not send crew to that region until certain conditions are verified. What conditions? This was never explained. 6 weeks later, program terminated. Cosmonauts reassigned. Hardware placed in storage and eventually scrapped. I believed for 30 years it was economic necessity. Now I wonder if someone knew something we were not meant to discover. Ratsesine. Quinn Castellano's analysis, published in a carefully worded paper that framed everything as speculative astrobiology rather than definitive conclusions, raised a question that most scientists had been avoiding because answering it meant confronting implications that were genuinely terrifying. If artificial structures existed on the Moon for 3.2 billion years, and if life on Earth had emerged 3.7 billion years ago, then the Moon may have been marked, surveyed, or prepared before complex life developed on our planet, which suggested intention, which suggested knowledge of Earth's potential, which suggested that whoever built those structures had either been monitoring our world across geological epochs or had possessed predictive capabilities that seemed indistinguishable from something far beyond any technology we could imagine. The Great Filter, the theoretical barrier that prevents civilizations from becoming spacefaring and therefore detectable, was usually conceptualized as something ahead of us, some future catastrophe or limitation we hadn't yet encountered. But what if that framework was wrong? What if the filter wasn't ahead of us, but had been watching us all along, evaluating us, waiting to see if we would develop the capability to understand what those structures meant? Quinn wrote in her paper's conclusion, "If intelligence predated us in this solar system by billions of years, and if evidence of that intelligence has been visible from Earth throughout human history, then the question is not whether we are alone. The question is whether we are ready to accept that we never were." The reason for the institutional silence, the coordinated suppression, the systematic erasure of evidence became clear not through any single leak or disclosure, but through a pattern of diplomatic movements that Marcus Webb pieced together over 3 months of investigation. In August of 2018, representatives from 8 nations with active or planned lunar programs, the United States, Russia, China, Japan, India, the European Space Agency member states, Canada, and the United Arab Emirates, gathered for what was publicly described as a routine International Astronautical Congress planning session in Geneva. The official agenda covered topics like lunar resource utilization protocols and orbital traffic management. But according to 2 separate sources who had security clearance for portions of that meeting, the actual discussions focused on a classified briefing presented jointly by NASA, Roscosmos, and CNSA intelligence divisions, a briefing that synthesized 50 years of accumulated evidence regarding geometric anomalies on the lunar surface and their potential implications for what one internal memo called Preparation for Confirmed Non-Terrestrial Intelligence Contact Scenarios. The consensus reached during those closed sessions, documented in meeting minutes that were never meant to be public, but that eventually found their way to Marcus through channels he would never reveal, even under legal pressure, was straightforward and pragmatic. Confirmation of ancient extraterrestrial structures on the Moon would trigger cascading instabilities across geopolitical, economic, and religious systems that were already under strain from climate change, resource competition, and ideological conflicts. Premature public disclosure without coordinated preparation could destabilize governments, crash financial markets dependent on assumptions about humanity's unique status in the cosmos, and potentially trigger existential crises among populations unprepared to contextualize their place in a universe where intelligence had existed billions of years before humans evolved. The decision made in Geneva was to pursue coordinated investigation under the cover of competitive national space programs, to prepare institutional frameworks for eventual disclosure, and to suppress evidence until verification was absolute and communication strategies were in place. It was a rational decision made by people trying to manage an impossible situation. It was also a decision that assumed they had time to prepare, that whatever was waiting on the Moon would remain dormant and patient, while humanity slowly adjusted to a new cosmic reality. But preparation was happening, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. NASA announced the Artemis program's long-term objectives in 2019. a permanent lunar base supporting continuous human presence by 2028. The location selected for Artemis Base Camp was in the lunar South Pole region, officially chosen for access to water ice in permanently shadowed craters. Unofficially, the coordinates placed the base 89 kilometers from one of the hexagon's vertices, the structure in Orientale Basin that had shown unusual albedo characteristics in every orbital survey since Apollo 16. China announced its International Lunar Research Station partnership with Russia in 2020, planning a robotic base by 2028 and crewed missions by 2035. The proposed location was in the South Pole region, 112 kilometers from a different vertex. India's Gaganyaan program, Japan's Lunar Exploration Program, the European Space Agency's Moon Village concept, every major spacefaring nation was planning permanent lunar infrastructure. And when Marcus plotted all their proposed locations on a selenographic map, the pattern was unmistakable. They were positioning themselves around the hexagon, like researchers setting up observation posts around an archaeological site they couldn't excavate directly, but were determined to monitor continuously. The official narrative was international competition, a new space race driven by resource extraction and national prestige. The actual coordination suggested something closer to a scientific expedition disguised as geopolitical rivalry, multiple nations working toward the same objective through parallel programs that could be publicly justified as independent initiatives. Blake Chen reappeared on March 7, 2025, 3 months after his discovery and 2 months after he'd vanished into CNSA's classification machinery. He attended a public symposium on lunar geology at Beijing Normal University, sat in the back row, and said nothing until the question period when a graduate student asked about recent advances in understanding lunar volcanic processes. Blake stood, identified himself, and made a statement that lasted 43 seconds before university security escorted him from the auditorium. A statement that was recorded on multiple smartphones and distributed across Chinese social media before censors could contain it. He said, "The moon preserves answers to questions we have not yet learned to ask, questions about where we came from, questions about whether the development of intelligence on Earth was inevitable or guided. Questions about what responsibilities come with the knowledge that we are not the first, that we may never have been the first, that the cosmos has been watching our world across time scales that make human civilization look like a single heartbeat. We will return to the moon, not to plant flags or extract resources, but to understand what has been waiting there for billions of years. We must learn. We have no choice now but to learn." Then, as security officers reached him, Blake looked directly at the cameras recording him and added, "They asked me what I saw. I saw what they wanted us to see: the door, the message, the invitation, or the warning." Marcus tracked down Blake's family 3 weeks later. They would only confirm that Blake was alive, undergoing psychological evaluation, and had been transferred to an undisclosed medical facility. But his younger sister, speaking briefly through a translator, and only on condition that her identity be protected, said, "My brother sent one more message before they took him away. He said there were stairs, descending. He did not say how far." On April 2, 2025, a private lunar imaging satellite operated by a commercial space company contracted to support NASA's Artemis program captured high-resolution photographs of the hexagon's center point, the far-side region that no human mission had directly observed. The images showed a ninth structure smaller than the vertices but geometrically distinct, approximately 43 meters in diameter and 27 meters tall, sitting at the exact center of the hexagon pattern within a margin of error of less than 200 meters. The structure appeared cylindrical with a domed top. But here was what made Riley Morrison's hands shake when she received the images through a colleague who still had access to commercial satellite data feeds. This structure did not appear in Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter images from 18 months earlier. The LRO had photographed that exact location in October 2023 as part of its systematic mapping campaign. The region had been empty regolith, unmarked except for typical impact cratering. Now there was a structure. Either it had been buried and recently exposed by some unknown process, or it had been built, or it had appeared. Riley spent 6 days analyzing every alternative explanation: photographic artifacts, orbital position errors, misidentified shadows, equipment malfunctions. None of them fit the data. Something that hadn't been visible on the moon's surface 2 years ago was visible now. Something was changing. Something was active. Or something was waiting. And the waiting was almost over. Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction author who had spent decades contemplating humanity's place in the cosmos, once wrote that 2 possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe, or we are not, and both possibilities are equally terrifying. But there is a third possibility that Clarke did not consider, or perhaps chose not, to write about, because the implications were too disturbing to contemplate openly. What if we are not alone, and never were? What if the evidence has been visible throughout human history, written in the geology of our closest celestial neighbor, waiting for us to develop the technology and the courage to look carefully at what has always been there? What if intelligence did not come to our solar system from distant stars, but has been here, watching Earth across geological epochs, marking our moon with structures that predate human civilization by billions of years, waiting? Through the rise and fall of countless species, until one finally developed the capability to recognize what those structures meant. The moon is 4.5 billion years old. Modern humans have existed for 300,000 years. Our technological civilization is less than 2 centuries old. We have been looking at the moon since the first human ancestor gazed upward at that pale disk hanging in the night sky. We have been asking if we are alone since the first human mind conceived the question. And all that time, the answer has been there, carved into craters and ancient highland regions, preserved in the airless void where erosion happens so slowly that monuments can survive longer than worlds. The question was never whether we are alone. The question is what happens now that we know we are not. What happens when the structures activate? What happens when the stairs descending lead somewhere we are not prepared to go? What happens when we finally understand that the moon was never just our satellite, but always someone else's message, waiting across deep time for us to be ready to receive it? Whether we are ready or not.